So, in this next section, what I want to do is I would like to introduce you to the ideas and some of the art that have a lot to do with what they knew during the Renaissance and how they looked at classicism. And to start with this, usually what I do in my class is I show them these stills from Star Trek. And the idea behind showing it to my students is to show them a couple of things that are clearly recognizable as classical. And in the Renaissance, they would have thought the same thing. So, for example, this figure here on the left hand side is he's wearing a toga. So, we've got like a little bit of a toga party. There's a white building with columns, and it has Ionic capitals on it. So, these are clearly recognizable emblems of what makes something classical. On his head here, he's wearing what looks like some kind of leaves, like ivy leaves. So he's wearing kind of ivy crown. And in this next one, he's seated on a throne with fluted columns next to him painted white. Now, this is actually kind of inaccurate in terms of what really happened during the classical era, but it does demonstrate that these are common types of iconography or visual vocabulary that everybody would recognize right away. And the same thing happens during the Renaissance. So, one of the first things that most people assume, and this is how it was taught to me even in high school, was that the Renaissance was this instantaneous period of everybody in Italy deciding instantaneously that they were going to go back and have a rebirth of classicism. In fact, the term Renaissance means renaissance, which means a rebirth if you reduce it down to its roots. And part of it was that they would go back and look at philosophy, look at plays, theater, literature, sculpture, and architecture, and that everybody saw these things in Italy at that time and recognized them immediately as high culture and better culture than the one we are in right now. It's not true. Basically, I did a quick lookup of what things were known during Florence in the 13th, 14th, and 15th century, and I made a little diagram for you. If you look at basically the architecture, what you'll see is that they had known about Greek classical buildings, especially the Parthenon on the Acropolis in Athens. And we're going to look at all of these things separately so that you understand what they might have understood. But basically, they knew about architecture through a first century architect's treatise on architecture called De Architectura. And people from Italy in the 14th century, let's say, were really aware of architecture by seeing it around Italy and looking at things that kind of looked like Greek temples. But to understand what it was, they had to look at this treatise that was written by a first century Roman. Now, in Rome, they did have some buildings and triumphal arches like the Colosseum and the Pantheon and all kinds of ruins left over, which would have informed their point of view, of, at least of what architecture looked like. However, they didn't have original Greek stuff, and in some ways they often conflated or put together, they didn't differentiate between Greek and Roman classical stuff. The sculptures that the Italians would have been familiar with, especially in Florence and in Rome, would have been Roman copies that had come a couple of centuries after these things were made. Polyclitus's Doryphorus, Myron's Discobolus, some Hellenistic sculptures, including the Laocoon group and his sons, and a bunch of Greek sarcophagi and Roman sarcophagi. So the other things that they would have come upon in their kinds of excavations, even of to build things, they would have come across portrait busts that were called Verist portrait busts. They would have come across graves that had sarcophagi in them, some public statues that were left over, things like that. And they after a while, started collecting these things because they looked at the classical past and thought that it was cool stuff. In terms of philosophy, they also got all of that through secondhand sources. And what I'm talking about when it comes to secondhand sources, the Arab world had all of these universities and academic institutions, and they had preserved a lot of these things. And so when the Romans were reading even Platonic texts and Aristotle's works, they were reading it almost like a game of telephone, second and third hand, and people reinterpreting them. And a lot of the stories, plays, and literature, like the Iliad and the Odyssey, weren't read in their original Greek. Instead, they were actually summaries that were written in Latin and retellings. And all of this stuff that we take for granted, that we have really good translations of, all of the original texts of the Republic, the Iliad and the Odyssey by Homer, they were not known in their original forms until much later, probably even the 16th and 15th century, they might have gotten hold of some of them. They did have some of the original texts that were Roman. And some of the Roman texts that they had, which would have been very important to them, were Virgil's Aeneid, Ovid's Metamorphoses, Caesar's Gallic Wars, and some other things like that. Theater was really not very important to them, and they probably wouldn't have even thought to want to perform Greek tragedies. But Greek tragedies actually were preserved first by the Muslim Arabic universities, and then later on they made their way sometimes to monasteries, and we don't have that many of those left. The periods that we take for granted that we know of are the classical period of ancient Greece that runs between 480 and 323. And it's also pretty much the time when a sort of republican and democratic period started, and where all of the art that we usually associate with high classicism comes from. The second period, which early historians, especially in the 17 and 1800s, didn't differentiate, was the Hellenistic period or the late Hellenistic period, and things start getting a little bit more dramatic. And then often we look at art from between 31 and 395 as the Roman period of classical art, but the Roman civilization started at the same time that the Greek civilization started, around 700 BCE. One of the people who the Romans would have heard of or been familiar with, or the Italians in Florence would have kind of known of, was a general named Pericles from Athens during its so-called Golden Age. He had a good reputation, and they had translated eventually Thucydides and Plutarch and some of his speeches, and they were circulated in Latin, and they became the formation or the foundation of a lot of Italian ideas about republican and democratic kinds of self-governance in different city-states. However, they only knew him at first through his reputation, not through texts or primary texts. Pericles was credited with rebuilding the Acropolis and with making Athens a great city in the 5th century, basically between 480 and around 400 BCE. Pericles fought a series of wars, kind of stole some money from a NATO-like league called the League of Delos, the Delian League, and rebuilt Athens into really a very important city that had philosophers, theater, it had incredible literature, had a new form of government. But for the Italians of the 13th, 14th, and 15th centuries, they would have been familiar with Socrates more or less as almost in a way, a rumor, not necessarily, they wouldn't have had any direct knowledge of him, except for eventually once Plato's texts that mentioned him were discussed. But they did think about Socrates, and so you should know who he was. In a nutshell, Socrates was a philosopher who taught using something called the Socratic method. It's named after him. It's basically questioning the students, asking them and soliciting what they know. And so he would ask a question, for instance, is God shaped like a human being? And the students would say, of course he is. And then he would say, why? And the students would answer something like, well, because we see these statues that look like the gods, and the gods are all anthropomorphic. They're all shaped like people. And he would say, well, wouldn't we as human beings assume that God looked like us and was shaped like a human being? And he would go down the line and keep questioning and questioning until he deconstructed or took apart their argument. Because once you get to so many whys, after a while, you are just exhausted in terms of what you can answer and what logic is. So these kids would go home at the end of the day and they would ask their parents really probing questions about the politics of the time or about ethics and things like that. And the parents, after a while, would become really annoyed because these kids are questioning their ethics, questioning their philosophies, and undermining basically their authority. And after a while, with most parents, they would say, because I said so. And so Plato is the guy, or Socrates is credited with the phrase question authority. And he's the one who says you need to challenge the pre-existing belief structure and see if you can critically deconstruct it. Well, for his troubles, he was put on trial for corrupting the youth of Athens, and he was eventually sentenced to death, and he could have fled. But instead, as in this painting from 1787 by Jacques-Louis David, he chose to die for a higher cause. That's why his finger is pointing up. And he chose to drink the poison, the hemlock, because he believed in Athenian law. So that made him a martyr and made his message even more powerful. So he's the first guy that is a philosopher that would have been very important for the Italians just because of a verbal transmission of that kind of story. Now, in the 16th century, 1509 to 1511, an artist named Raphael, who we'll be studying later, paints this painting called The School of Athens. And in the School of Athens, there's various interpretations of it, but the main characters in it are these philosophers who we're talking about: Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, mathematicians like Heraclitus. And it's almost like a school photo, and we have these images of important people, of Pythagoras and Heraclitus over here, and we're going to study that more in depth, but they're using a vocabulary that's classical. You can see a classical arch, classical white sculptures in there, a vaulted ceiling or an arched ceiling that looks a little bit like something that we're going to be studying in a couple of minutes called the Pantheon. So what the Italians from the 13th, 14th, and 15th centuries believed is that they were starting to reboot or renew a belief in classical ideas, and they were also reconciling it with Christian and Catholic religious ideals. And so one of the philosophies is called Neoplatonism, which is not exactly what Plato taught, but it's kind of derived from it. So Plato is this philosopher who follows after Socrates. He's his student. And Plato comes up with the idea of thinking about ideal systems of government, ideal systems of how to behave. He writes a treatise that's called The Republic, which is a kind of utopian government. And they were aware of Plato and Platonic thinking, which is thinking about the world in terms of ideals rather than the physical world, and thinking about the world as a place of spirituality rather than a place of physicality. And they might have even known a little bit of his most important text that everybody has to read in high school, called The Allegory of the Cave, which is an allegory that discusses education, but they didn't have the full text in Florence and in Rome until more or less the 15th century, so the 1400s. Aristotle is the physical sciences guy, and a lot of his texts were very important for centuries before the Renaissance, and they were used as a foundation of thought for a lot of colleges and universities during the medieval period. A lot of his texts were saved in the Arab world by Muslim scholars, and his texts then were later on translated back into Latin off of the Arabic translations, and that's one of the reasons why we have them. And he's the guy who believed in naming things in terms of looking at things in terms of cause and effect. You might say he's the father of scientific method, although in the medieval period, they didn't think of it as cause and effect in scientific method in the same way that we might have. One of the most important philosophers, but also artists from this time period, from classical Greece, is an artist by the name of Polykleitos. Polykleitos wrote a treatise on sculpture called the Canon, and he made a sculpture that represented his main ideas of what the canon were or was. And we only have leftover sculptures that are copies of the original Greek sculptures, and the copies that we have left over were made by Romans centuries after Polykleitos made his Doryphorus. And Doryphorus means spear bearer. We don't have the treatise left over anymore, but we know that the Romans respected Greek art and used this as a way of creating their own art and respected Greek ideals. And so some of the concepts that trickle all the way up to the Renaissance are an idea called kalos, can be spelled with a K or a C, which is the idea that something that's beautiful is also morally good, and that the two concepts are more or less interchangeable. The other idea of that the Doryphorus or spear bearer or canon embodies is the idea that kalos also represents almost a Platonic ideal of a young, beautiful male, nude, who would be almost the perfect warrior. Plato believed that nature was as close to the ideal as possible, and it's also possible that Polykleitos thought the same thing, although he comes before Plato. And so one of the ways that you make a sculpture more lifelike is to have it stand in a counterposed posture called contrapposto. And the contrapposto that we're looking at here is one of the legs is bearing all the weight and a hip is sort of raised or cocked. The other leg is slightly bent and the heel is raised off of the ground, and it causes the body to have a sort of S curve, a naturalistic curve to it that is a counter pose or a counter posture, this S curve. In some versions of contrapposto, the torso is turned opposite to the direction of the hips, and that's also a sort of counter or contra kind of look. Originally, this would have been holding a spear, and the Roman copies that were in marble didn't have the same strength or tensile strength. They couldn't stand with their heel raised, so they had to put a little wedge of marble underneath the heel, and even attach struts between the body and the arm, and add tree trunks. So all of the Roman copies that we have left over are our best guess of what this looked like. So there was a concept in ancient Greece that I think also applies in some ways to Italian art as well, which is the idea that the original schema, the original plan of art, especially in ancient Greece, was less naturalistic, less real. And over time, the better art gets, the more naturalistic, the more realistic it is, and the more it's modeled on nature. So that is one of those things that we refer to and we sort of credit to Plato. there was an art historian named Ernst H. Gombrich who came up with this concept of schema, and then the updated version he would call a correction. And it's not really that it's correct, it's that it's evolved almost in a Darwinian way. And one of the ideas about the proportions that are expressed in the Doryphorus or canon also ties in with the mathematician named Pythagoras. And Pythagoras is that guy, it's a squared plus b squared equals c squared. He believed that numbers underlay everything in the universe and were also part of a kind of divine order. And if you understood mathematics and you understood numbers, then you would be able to figure out how the world worked and how the universe worked. And that ties in a little bit even with modern or contemporary studies. I found this on the internet, and basically there were some scientists who literally attached some sort of sensor array to people's heads and measured their responses to the different proportions of the ratios of Polyclitus's Doryphorus, and found that the one that was the original one with the most perfect proportions actually stimulated their brains the best and was considered the most beautiful. And I think that intrinsically or somehow instinctively during the Renaissance, they knew this as well. So almost all of the art that we are studying from the ancient world, at least that the Italians knew of, was reproductions of early Greek sculpture. And the Romans had so much respect that they just reproduced them and made multiple copies. And often these copies are kind of inferior or not as beautiful as the originals. So keep that in mind when you're looking at this. This Discobolus, which is a Roman copy from the sculpture Myron. I've heard it pronounced Miron as well, which is also from the High Classical period, is a depiction of a male athlete throwing the discus at an Olympic event. And it ties in with that concept of kalos and beauty. And the way that originally Greek sculpture worked, it was supposed to be just, even though it was sculpture in the round, you could walk completely around it. It was meant to be seen from one particular point of view. And in this instance, the artist chose to take the middle pose when the arm is swung back in the throwing of the discus, and that way you could put this flat against a wall and it would make sense as a sculpture. But if you look at these hands, they're a little bit disproportionate. They're not as well crafted. Now, all of these Roman copies that we're looking at, there are multiple Roman copies. And sometimes when they found these sculptures and would bring them back to museums, for instance, this Townley Discobolus, they would put a different head on it that was found nearby, thinking that they were reassembling it correctly. So who knows which version of these Roman copies is the most accurate? Another tradition that comes from ancient Rome is a tradition called the Verus tradition. And in Florence and in Rome, they would have been familiar with Roman portrait sculpture that we call verism because it's verist. It looks very true. You verify what this person looks like, warts and all. And so they would have dug up portrait busts like this all over the place and would have thought of them as, oh, that's a pretty great style. Let's see if we can copy this, if we can bring this tradition back. And so this one was collected by the Barberini family, and it was in their collection from the 1600s. And he's wearing a toga, and it's the Togatus Barberini, which basically means it's a sculpture portrait of a guy wearing a toga that was in the Barberini collection. And one of the things that I want you to see from this is that the face is ultra realistic, and it's showing realist and naturalistic looking faces. Now in this sculpture, this is actually sort of a copy of of it's a sculpture of a man holding portrait busts of his ancestors. So it'd be sort of like you standing there holding a portrait, a photograph of someone from your family to show where you came from, and it might be an antique photograph. Originally, those portrait busts that he was holding would be made originally out of wax, and then later on they started making them out of marble and out of bronze. And also, these sculptures would have been painted, but in the Italian Renaissance, they did not know that these sculptures would have been painted originally. The last component of it, notice that he's also standing in contrapposto, and that the drapery that is his toga, his clothing, is showing the form underneath it. It portrays or shows the kneecaps and the curve of the shoulders and the arms. And that's an extension of a tradition called wet drapery style that we'll be looking at later, that was also brought back during the Renaissance as a style of showing you the anatomy underneath the clothing and underneath the drapery. This also ties in with what we're going to see in Italian Renaissance portraiture, which ties into, in the Roman Republic, there was a tradition of verism in which you show the father, the pater, who is a leading governor, and you portray him with dignitas, which is basically, it's what it sounds like, it's dignity, but it also has to do with showing his reputation. So this is one of the things, and dignitas was also tied in a little bit with showing your heritage and where you came from, and that's why he's holding the portrait busts, and you're going to see that in Renaissance portraiture later on. Now, this sculpture wasn't discovered or known until the early 1500s, and Michelangelo was there right after they pulled it out of the ground in Rome. So we don't actually even know if it's Greek or if it's Roman. Originally, there was a base on it that had an inscription that said, this is by Hagisandros, Polydorus, and Athenodorus of Rhodes, who were Greek sculptors. But unfortunately, the base is missing, and it was lost several hundred years ago, so we don't know if even that's accurate. The sculpture itself, the way that it's sort of seated and twisting in a serpentine kind of movement, which Michelangelo called serpenata, was really influential on Michelangelo, and the kind of grotesque look on his face and the movement of the body and the hypermusculature are all things that had a profound influence on Michelangelo. So we can see that this piece of art that could be Roman, it could be Greek Hellenistic, would have had a very strong influence. And it also ties in quite a bit with some of the literary ideas and the kind of schema and correction or the evolution of literature. One of the things that you might want to look up independently is Homer's Iliad and his Odyssey. The Iliad is a war story in which Agamemnon and Odysseus and Achilles and a whole bunch of Greek heroes siege the city of Troy because Helen of Troy has been taken away by Paris, who is a son of Troy and Agamemnon's wife. And so there's a battle that happens. The Odyssey is a story of how that returns. But the sort of spin-off of Homer's Iliad that was written down around 700 or 800 BCE in Greek is Virgil's Aeneid that comes from the 1st century in Rome around the time of Caesar. So Virgil was a Roman poet, and in the Aeneid, he describes the birth of Rome and how it ties in with the events in the Iliad. And in the Aeneid is a kind of recounting or story about how the Greeks got into the city of Troy by hiding themselves inside a big wooden horse that was presented at the gates. And so the Greeks present this Trojan horse at the front gate, and the priest Laocoon says, "Beware of Greeks bearing gifts." This is kind of a paraphrase. And for his trouble, because he's caused all kinds of trouble, Athena and or Poseidon, depending on who you're talking to, suggests that the Athena was angry at Laocoon for disrespecting the Greeks and for warning them, the Trojans, and she sent these serpents to destroy him. I've also heard different versions where, well, if he's a celibate priest, why does he have sons? And that's why he was destroyed. But that's a debate that you can bring up in a classics class. So we need to get into architecture, and we're going to start with Greek architecture, and we're going to see how Greek architecture relates to Greek philosophy and how Greek architecture is an expression of almost Platonic and Pythagorean ideas, and that the Italians from the Renaissance who were familiar with Vitruvius's treatise on architecture would have been familiar with this, and also would have been somewhat familiar with Pythagoras, especially because Pythagorean texts having to do more or less with geometry and a kind of form of algebra and series of ratios would have been really important to mathematicians, especially in the Arab world, who were very much into math and science. So Pythagoras was a Greek philosopher who lived just before the so-called Golden Age of Pericles, and he thought that numbers were literally divine. And he also was a little bit of a whack job. He was a little crazy in terms of what his philosophies were, but we know him basically because of some of the things that we even use today. For instance, a squared plus b squared equals c squared, right? And we also know that he had a concept called symmetria. And it ties in with his Pythagorean religion, which is basically symmetria has to do with the idea that numbers are divine and measuring, and that if you can figure out weights and numbers and ratios, you can figure out how the universe works, and you can somehow tap into the music of the spheres, which is also something that Aristotle talked about, and it's also a very important concept when it comes to medieval scholarship. Now, he also thought that these ideas were expressed primarily in ratios. So this building called the Parthenon from 450 BCE, which the Italians during the Renaissance would have been familiar with through reputation and through travel writing, mainly through almost like people writing down about their journeys, is called the Parthenon. Now, the term Parthenon means virgin chamber. It was built by a couple of architects, Iktinos and Callicrates, sometimes pronounced Iktinos and Callicrates, and I've also seen the K's spelled with C's. And it was also decorated with sculpture by an architect or a sculptor named Phidias. The most important thing about this is it expresses beauty or kalos through its expression of symmetry or symmetria. Now, our idea of symmetry is different. It means same measure for us. You can cut something in half, and that is true about this building. But if you notice, across the front of the building, there are 8 columns. Down the side of the building, you would think that, okay, you would do it in a ratio of 2, so it'd be 8 columns across the front and then 16 down the side. But Pythagoras suggests that you can play with irrational ratios like 17 to 8, which is expressed in those algebraic expressions beneath it. And if you look at this image of the Parthenon, the way it's canted off to the side, it almost looks like it's 3 times as long down the side as the front. And this is an expression of the beauty of those proportions. Now, the Athenians who constructed this, Iktinos and Callicrates, would have known that people were going to approach this from the back side of it, and as you come through a gateway, it's actually at this angle to you. They manipulate your point of view so that you have to see this building as being enormous. Now, the building itself also has the use of what's called the Doric order. And The people during the Renaissance understood the Greek orders because it was re-upped or retranslated in these treatises by Vitruvius in his book De Architectura. And you need to know about the Doric, Ionic, and Corinthian orders of columns because they are used extensively during the Renaissance, Baroque, Neoclassical, like from this point on again. So the Doric order is considered kind of the most masculine. It's named after Doria. It has a simple column or shaft that doesn't have a base on it, so it's not wearing shoes is how I describe it. And it has a simple cap on it, a capital, that has an abacus, which is a block that imposes itself between the architrave and the echinus. The echinus, I think, is named after sea urchins, and it is the capital of the column. And then on top of that, you have an architrave that sometimes is inscribed with some kind of writing. And then the frieze above that, which consists of metopes and triglyphs. And the metopes would have had decorations on them. In the case of the Parthenon, we'll be looking at the Battle of the Lapis and the Centaurs. The next more feminine order that is named after another region, Ionia, which is a Greek colony, has a pair of shoes, the base on it, and is considered to be a little bit more femi in its order. And the capital or head on it has a curly Q hairstyle that has two rolls on it that are called volutes. And then it has a kind of similar entablature to the Doric order, except for it does not have this alternation of triglyphs and metopes in its entablature. The architrave is also usually pretty simple. So this is a more complicated, more complex order. And then the next order that we'll be looking at is the Corinthian, named after Corinth. And it has a kind of basket of leaves at the top with a little bit of a volute at the top, and has the same components in its entablature as the Ionic order. You'll also see later on composites of these three orders in Renaissance and Baroque buildings. So if you know the components and you can name them, you'll be able to recognize how they're used in later architecture. So we go a little bit more into detail about the Parthenon and talk a little bit about it. This is what it looked like in 1875, and I have a little bit more of a complete story about it, but basically in the text that is included with the course. And you'll notice that in 1875 it was just destroyed. It was in ruins, and that was because in one of the wars, the Venetians had kept a munitions dump inside of it, and the Turks lobbed a cannonball in it and it blew it up from the inside out. And so they've been trying to put it together ever since. So what I want to do is talk about some of the decorations in the entablature at the top. I also want to talk about how the columns kind of swell in the center, because you'll see that in the Renaissance as well. And I also want to talk about how they distorted or curved some things in the building, and how these ideas are adapted, especially later on in the 17 and 1800s, by Europeans who are familiar by this point with what the Parthenon is or was, and they actually do take trips to visit it. So some of the more important ideas, if you study classical architecture more in depth, and if you have taken my earlier class, I go into this in a lot more detail, is that the Parthenon has a kind of curve to it that some people have claimed is meant to make it look more organic, or to visually adjust for the curvatures in the eyes. There is no proof of either one of these things, so it's up to debate. So I will give you the theories. So first of all, if you look at the columns, and I will look at a set of columns on an Italian temple that has these two in a minute, the columns sort of swell in the center, and this is called entasis. I've also heard it pronounced entasis. And there are two explanations for this: that the weight of the entablature on top is almost making it bow out like a balloon in a way, Or it could be that when you're standing at the base of the column, looking up, that kind of shift in from the middle and it narrows towards the capital at the top is a way of intensifying the feeling of height, because parallel lines as they move away from you in space seem to converge at a point in the distance. So it may be a sort of preliminary understanding of linear perspective. It also may be an attempt to show the weight of the entablature on top. Now, the base of the Parthenon, called the stylobate. Stylos means column, and that's where we get the word style from and the different styles of column. And the stereobate, which are two bases, curves a little bit up. And that is thought to also compensate for the curvature of the eyes and to make it appear straighter. I don't know if that's really accurate. And if you look at in this diagram, the two outer columns that are marked with a C also lean in slightly. And all of these corrections or visual things that are going on are supposedly either to compensate for the curvature of the eye, or to make the building look like more of an organic structure, or to show the weight of the entablature on top, and to make the lines look straighter. So the entasis that we're looking at, this is a temple from Italy, believe it or not. One of the best preserved Greek temples ever is in a place called Paestum in Italy. And you can really see it in this photograph, the entasis on this, that the columns are really kind of narrowing about halfway up the column and almost leaning into the center there. The next set of components that I'd like to talk about are the more or less the entablature and the ornamentation on them in the pediment and the metopies and the frieze that you see here. And strictly speaking, the Parthenon is supposed to be a Doric temple, but it's a kind of double-walled structure, and so the interior frieze that runs through the interior of the building has a continuous running frieze that shows basically a parade that's taking place in Athens called the Panathenaic Procession. And then in between the triglyphs and metopes, the metopes show a scene of centaurs, which are half human, half horse creatures, fighting it out with a humans called the Lapiths, and that's actually a precursor to the story of the Iliad. So here's that continuous running frieze from the interior called the Panathenaic Procession. These panels were removed in the 1800s by a Scottish lord who was visiting. He was an ambassador to Turkey, and the Turkish government allowed him to take these panels home to Scotland and put them on his home. And after he passed away, they were contributed or given to the British Museum. So a lot of Greek sculptures from the Acropolis in Athens are now in the British Museum, which is a cause for some argument that they should be returned by some people. Some people are saying that they're preserving them for posterity. You can look this debate up yourself and figure it out. But the more important parts of this is that we're going to see an awareness of friezes like this in Italian Renaissance art. And what we see here is everything is arranged to be at its most beautiful angle. There is a kind of movement to the horses that show the anatomy accurately and the anatomy of the figures of these guys in the parade. And a big component of Greek art is the nude. And so we have these guys who are nude on horseback, who are riding in a parade in celebration of Athens and a kind of political celebration of the city of Athens and how great it is. It's partially religious, it's partially political, and you can think about it as a theocratic kind of government with a little bit of democracy or republican thrown in. And of course, you can look that kind of stuff up. But we're going to see a lot of sculptures, especially friezes, that look similar to this, especially Ghiberti's doors and some of the friezes above some of the churches and things like that. It's also going to be a heavy influence on Michelangelo, especially in his Sistine Chapel ceiling and his Last Judgment on the back wall of the Sistine Chapel. These metopes that I was talking about have these sculptures that show the human body in almost like a dance pose, and that's often referred to as eurythmic gesture or eurythmia, which is a kind of dance pose that's meant to show the body off in its most flattering and advantageous way. And we see here this figure who has idealized heroic musculature, which also becomes an important component of Renaissance art, is about to decapitate or club the head of this centaur, who it appears he has bound. And the centaur and he are in a kind of visual balance in terms of the composition. You could think of Pythagoras' symmetria as symmetry in this instance, where you can cut it directly in half, and half of it is devoted to the human half, and half of it is devoted to the centaur half. And an interesting component also about this is that the centaur's human part of the body is on really not a horse's body, but more like a pony-sized body, because they want it to be a balance between the human part and the horse part, which is part of the symbols or iconography of this piece, which is referred to often as a Dionysian-Apollonian conflict. Dionysus represents the god of liberality and being wild and drama and wine, and so he is represented somewhat by the wildness of the centaurs, and the human being is supposed to represent enlightenment and reason and logic, and so that is Apollonian, and those are the Lapith people who are fighting the centaurs off. One of the other things that this metope demonstrates, and that they also use during the Renaissance, is that there's an awareness of the angle or point of view that sculptures would have been looked at. So when you're looking at the image on the right-hand side, what you see is this is placed in the British Museum at eye level, and you would photograph it just from this point of view. And if you really think about it, it's kind of weird looking compared to the one on the left, which is meant to be seen sado in su, which means from below to above. And it starts to look a little bit more reasonable in this image, where you can see that the point of view is compensated for, that you're looking at it from beneath. And that kind of sado in su kind of thing is going to be something that you'll see in some of the relief sculptures, especially of the baptistry doors in Florence. A couple of views of the sculpture from different points of view to kind of show you the idealized musculature and the realistic representation of anatomy that ties in with that concept of kalos. Now, one of the things that was pretty obvious to especially the Romans was that they would walk around the city and there were ruins left over. And one of the things that was left over throughout the city of Rome and is still standing today were the aqueducts. And aqueducts are a really supreme feat of engineering. They piped in water for 20 or 30 miles into downtown Rome. And some of the pipelines started out above ground, and then in order to make sure that they were protected against some sort of military incursion, they actually had pipes that ran underneath the ground. And all of these aqueducts are supported by some very important and complex Roman technology. Now, the first thing that you look at is that the top of the aqueduct where the piping runs is supported by a series of arches, and these are called Roman arches. And Roman arches are a very important form of technology because they transmit the force down the sides of that arch and then vertically into the piers or bases. They also used different kinds of cement and masonry together with this. So the Romans were really super great at technology and understanding architecture. And we're going to see that this becomes part of the vocabulary of Italian Renaissance art as well. The Colosseum is a great example of this. And so the Colosseum, this is what's left over after centuries, and it went through many different uses. It was a church at some point. It was a monastery at some points. It was used as a place where they had gladiatorial games and had some sort of sports events in ancient Rome. And it also was a great source of building materials for the Romans after the fall of Rome from probably around 400 or 500 all the way up to the 12 or 1300s. So people actually lived inside of this thing too, and people stole the marble facing that clad the outside. They stole the bricks. They just would go in and mine it. Now, for us, some of the more important components of looking at it have to do with the technology and the decorative stuff. So let's start with the technology, and then we can get to the decorative stuff in a minute. The technology has to do with that Roman arch that I was telling you about. So the Roman arch relies principally on a simple concept that takes two upright piers and then starts building a series of blocks of stone that are wedge-shaped that meet up in the center of the arch, which is A, which we would call a keystone. And these arches transmit the force straight down into B and then C and D. And because arches use less material and don't need to be what's called post and lintel in terms of architecture, and they don't need to be made out of solid stone, they're also really economically more feasible. After a while, the Romans figured out that you could take a Roman arch and then just keep building it back almost infinitely to make a tunnel that we refer to as a barrel vault. And you would use a fairly complex use of concrete and cement, and they really figured it out in terms of using a volcanic ash called pozzolana from Pozzoli, which slowed the drying time. And by using different layers of stone and brick and fill, two of which are opus incertum and opus reticulatum, and fill it in with concrete and then face it with bricks so that it was beautiful. After a while, they figured out that you could take two barrel vaults and intersect them, and that is the heart of an intersecting what's called a groin vault, and that was used extensively during the Romanesque periods and the Gothic periods, which precede the scope of this class. Now, the tunnels that were running through the Colosseum start out as simple Roman arches that become tunnels, and then there's actually a circle that intersects it, a tunnel that runs in a complete circle around the interior of it with an intersecting vault. And this allowed for really stable structure that was built in 3 tiers very powerfully. And so the ornamentation on the outside, the columns and the facade or facing of marble, was kind of unnecessary after a point. So all of these columns that we're looking at on the exterior are just for show, to show that the Romans understood stuff about Greek and Roman art, and that they were able to use their technology to make a building that use the Greco or Greek style, but use their technology to build it up and to build this wonderful interior structure that also was extremely flexible. Apparently, they even filled it with water at one point and had mock naval battles there. Now, the exterior of the Colosseum, if we look at it a little bit more closely, uses the three orders that we've already talked about, but they're a little bit different than the Doric, Ionic, and Corinthian, but they do have that flavor. So the bottom level has what kind of looks like the Doric order, okay? It could be the Tuscan order, but it's the heaviest, most masculine. And then as we move up the structure, we've got a lighter order called the Ionic order, and then a more fancy, even lighter order called the Corinthian that has those Corinthian capitals on top. And then as you move up, these flattened columns are called pilasters, Pilasters. And they are just decorative as well. That was the top layer where the slaves and the women could stand and watch the games. Now, the point of this, there are various interpretations, as it goes from heavier to lighter to lighter to lightest as we move up the exterior of the building. But another way of thinking about it is that it's also almost like a history lesson, or at least showing their command of the vocabulary of Roman columns. Now, in the sort of shadow of the Colosseum are a couple of different structures, and one of them happens to be the Arch of Titus. And so the Italians who lived in Rome at the beginning of the Renaissance, well, throughout time, were familiar with these what are called Roman triumphal arches. And Roman triumphal arches were built as a way to celebrate a victory over another precinct or culture or peoples. And often they were built temporarily at first from things like wood and stucco and plaster, but then eventually sometimes they were remade or even initially made out of stone with brick. And they're using the arch as a way to honor the gateway into the city. And because the Roman arch is a superior technology, they're also making it a symbol of their own superiority. And in the same way, we also see that the Roman arch is a symbol at this point of cultural technology, of superiority. They're also incorporating, not as a support system, the system that they have conquered or understood from the earlier periods of the Greek traditions by putting columns that are called engaged columns on the exterior of this. Now, these columns often had inscriptions on them, and we're going to see similar things in Renaissance Europe. And they have friezes on the interiors of the doors. Now, this one in particular was even at one point converted into a house, and you'll see some holes in some of the friezes that we're looking at, the sculptures, in the actual sculpture that was there. Now, all of this would have been painted. It would have been painted in bright, weird colors that we're not used to. And this shows the Roman Emperor Titus and his victory over the Jews in Jerusalem. And they are carrying off the spoils of the temple. And if you look at this picture within a picture, you have a Roman arch on the right-hand side, which is a symbol of triumph as well. And they're literally carrying their loot through this archway, and they are wearing laurel leaves, a crown of laurel leaves on their head. Remember that first image we looked at from Star Trek where he was wearing that, and that crown is a symbol of triumph. The drapery is that drapery that reveals the form underneath. It almost looks like it's dampened or wet drapery in some ways. And the layering of the figures is starting to portray some kind of space. And we'll see that that becomes really important in Renaissance art. And there is a bit of a rudimentary understanding in Roman art of what we call linear perspective. Now, the last building that we're going to look at is the Pantheon. And I asked an AI program to create an image of what it would have looked like in its original conception. It would have been placed within a courtyard, more or less. And your vision or your view of it, I think that the columns and the edges would have been really against the portico in the front. But basically, the Pantheon was the building that was the go-to building for all of the Italian Renaissance architects to look at because it has an incredible dome on the interior. Pan means all, theos is religion or God. So Pan is all of the gods contained in this building. It was also used kind of as a courthouse for the Emperor Hadrian, but it is really more of a crowning achievement in terms of technology, and that's why it's so important, because when we look at the dome on Florence Cathedral that was made by Brunelleschi, we're going to see that he directly studied the Pantheon to see how you would make a dome like this. So this is what it would have looked like originally, and I won't go too much into the history. You can look it up in the text or go to the other class. But originally it was built for or by Marcus Agrippa. It says on the exterior, Agrippa Coster Fecit, which basically Marcus Agrippa made this. I've got the quote there for you. And unfortunately, something happened to the building. It either burnt down or there was a problem. And so later on, the Emperor Hadrian has it rebuilt. And in order to preserve its monumentality and the idea of it being part of history, he put that inscription on the front of it. So Hadrian has it rebuilt, and it's possible he was the architect. It's also possible that another guy named Apollodorus of Damascus might have been the architect as well. We are not sure. And I also believe that Apollodorus of Damascus was put to death by Hadrian over some kind of misunderstanding or some kind of argument. And this model on the right hand shows how it might have looked at the time that it was built in 118 to 125 Common Era. The exterior portico looks like the Parthenon. It looks like a Greek temple, and it has Corinthian types of columns on the front, and it has a doorway that leads in. And when you get inside, you're supposed to be literally shocked by this enormous spherical space on the interior. And the cutaway kind of shows some of the technologies that were used to create this building. And so it's going to be important because Brunelleschi uses similar technologies. All right, so let's start with the cutaway and talk about how, if you look at this cutaway, you can see that as it comes near the drum at the base, it becomes super thick, and they're using different kinds of Roman brick and fill and masonry, and then there's a facade or veneer of marble on the interior to fancy it up, dress it up. As you go towards the top of the dome, you'll see that the dome itself on the exterior kind of has steps, and it is super thick as it's near the bottom, and then as it moves towards the oculus, which means eye or hole in the top, which was designed to let the smoke out, let light in, and yeah, it lets in rainwater, but they had a drain in there as well. And the composition of this dome changes in terms of the cement that was used, and the composition starts at the bottom with a heavy aggregate of gravel and heavier stone. And as it moves up, they start introducing what's called volcanic tufa, which is that very porous, light volcanic rock as you get near the oculus at the top. And so it becomes heavy at the bottom and lighter as it moves up the top. And these coffers we see are also a way of drawing your eye up visually, but they're also a way of scooping out some of the cement or concrete to make it a little bit lighter as well. The buzz on this that my teacher mentioned 35 years ago was that they used sand in the interior to help build the scaffolding, and they filled it up with sand first and then built the scaffolding on top of that. So if we look at the exterior of this building, one of the things I want to point out is that kind of a little bit like an egg carton uses these arch-like things in the design of the egg carton. If you look at the exterior of the drum, they've built in arches into the exterior of the drum to further support. It's almost like a skeleton on the interior of the brick wall. Now, you wouldn't have been able to see this when it was first built, but it's really kind of miraculous that they combine these arches inside the masonry along with these bands or strips of heavy masonry to support the horizontal thrust of the dome that's on top. This is what it looks like inside, and I chose a painting by, ironically, a guy named Panini. The guy named Sandwich from the 16 or 1700s does a very good painting of it because it's kind of hard to catch it in a photograph. And it shows the interior and how polychromed or multicolor the different kinds of stones and marbles would have been used on the interior. And then this photograph on the right-hand side shows the scale of it, how large the coffers are at the bottom if you were standing on that ring that runs around the edge of it, and how it's made out of concrete and sort of scooped out. So they understood how to slow the drying time of cement and concrete well enough to be able to pour sections of this dome at a time. Now, the other thing that some historians talk about is that the coffers have a kind of square within a square within a square, which if you are, let's say, walking down a hallway, you can see that the doorways at the very end of the hallway would look very small. This is shows a kind of understanding of linear perspective that really gets developed in the 1500s in Renaissance Europe. So it serves many purposes. It pulls your eye out, and then the squares get smaller as they get near the oculus at the very top. So if you look at the interior of it, and this is the original floor and some of the ornamentation, it's a very impressive interior structure. And some of the things that the Romans use in a non-standard way is they have these little temples within the temple that look almost like garages or niches that have pediments that are the triangular pediments and then rounded pediments on top, and each one of these niches would have contained a sculpture. Later on, once Christianity was legalized in Rome, they had put statues of saints in there, and this building was turned into a church, and it was also used as, I think Raphael is buried there, and it was used as a meeting hall. At one point, the Barberini okayed them to take the bronze ceiling off of the portico and use it to melt down to make a what's called the baldacchino in the center of St. Peter's. So this photograph shows you how influential the Roman design of this would have been on the later Italian Romans in terms of how they would have decorated churches, because it's right there. They would have seen it. And the polychromy and use of different kinds of stones to create a multicolor. Remember that underneath this, it's all brick and cement, and that those columns really don't serve a structural purpose. They're really there to show off their understanding of the Greco-Roman tradition.